The sun rose over the hills of a small, quiet African village, casting golden light on the red clay paths and neatly arranged huts. At the heart of this village was Mboro, a young man whose good looks and charm were legendary. His name echoed from the mouths of nearly every woman in the village, young, middle-aged, even the elderly whispered his praises. He walked with a self-assured swagger, fully aware of the effect he had on those who crossed his path. Mboro wasn't just handsome, he was cunning. With a smooth tongue and a smile that could melt hearts, he had managed to wrap several women around his finger, never committing to any but leaving them wanting more. His allure lay in his ability to make each woman feel special. Though, in truth, he was always thinking of how they could serve him, but his interest didn't lie in the young maidens like most men in the village. No, Mboro preferred the attention of elderly women, particularly the wealthier ones. The older they were, the more vulnerable they seemed to his charms, and to Mboro, this was a sign of power. These women, often widows with land and riches, doted on him with a desperation that amused him. To him, it wasn't love, it was about control. He enjoyed the thrill of manipulating them, watching how they yearned for him, bending to his every whim. They gave him gifts, food, money, clothes, and, in return, he offered them affection, but only just enough to keep them hooked. Among all his conquests, there was one who stood out. Ndizi was her name, an elderly woman who had outlived 2 husbands and amassed a significant amount of wealth. Her large, sprawling compound was one of the most prominent in the village, and she had no children to inherit it. Ndizi had fallen deeply for Mboro's charms. Every day, he would visit her, and she would shower him with gifts. She fed him lavish meals and bought him new clothes, eager to keep him close. In her eyes, Mboro was not just a fleeting lover, he was the one she intended to pass her wealth on to. Mboro, of course, knew this. He could see how Ndizi was so deeply under his spell that she would do anything for him. He played along, letting her believe that they shared something special. His visits became less frequent, but when he did appear, he was showered with even more gifts, as if his absence had only intensified her desire to please him. As Mboro strutted down the village paths, the women he passed smiled shyly or giggled behind their hands. He winked at a few, leaving them flustered. He knew that with a word or a look, he could have any of them, but why bother with the young girls? They had nothing to offer but admiration. The older women, on the other hand, had wealth and influence, things he craved more than youthful beauty. It was a typical day for Mboro, basking in the attention and adoration, when he heard whispers of a new family that had just moved into the village. The men were all talking about a girl, Akinyi. They spoke of her beauty with such awe that even Mboro's interest was piqued. They said she was so beautiful that men nearly fell off their bicycles when she walked by. Still, Mboro dismissed the thought at first. What could a young girl offer him that Ndizi or the other older women couldn't? He was confident in his routine, enjoying the wealth and influence he had gained through Ndizi and others like her. But as he overheard more and more men talking about Akinyi, his curiosity grew. Could she really be that beautiful? More beautiful than the young women he had ignored in the past? Perhaps it wouldn't hurt to see for himself. The village was abuzz with excitement. Word had spread quickly about the new family that had moved in, and all the men, young and old, were captivated by the tale of their daughter, Akinyi. They spoke of her beauty as though she were a rare jewel, shimmering under the African sun. She had smooth, dark skin that seemed to glow, large, expressive eyes that captured the light, and a grace in her movement that turned heads wherever she went. The men exaggerated her allure so much that some claimed she was the most beautiful woman the village had ever seen. Mboro, hearing all this talk, couldn't ignore the intrigue. At first, he was dismissive, thinking that the men were exaggerating, as they often did when a new woman entered the village. But over time, the constant chatter made him curious. Could this Akinyi really be all that? One afternoon, as Mboro strolled through the village, he caught sight of her for the first time. She was standing in the market square, her long braids cascading down her back as she helped her mother buy vegetables. She wasn't just beautiful, she was stunning, even more than the rumors had claimed. For the first time in a long while, Mboro felt a flicker of genuine desire. As he watched her from across the market, his arrogance returned. He had seduced countless women before, many with far more experience and maturity than Akinyi. He was certain that winning her over would be no different. After all, He had the charm, the looks, and the confidence to conquer anyone. Mboro straightened his clothes, put on his most charming smile, and made his way toward her. As he approached, the other men in the market watched with envy. They knew Mboro's reputation with women, and many had already resigned themselves to the fact that if Mboro decided to pursue Akinyi, she would be his. "Akinyi," he said smoothly when he was close enough, his voice warm like honey. "I've heard a lot about you." Akinyi turned, her eyes meeting his, and for a brief moment, she froze. She had heard of Mboro as well, who hadn't? He was the village's Prince Charming, the man who could have any woman he wanted. His reputation preceded him, but standing there in front of her, he was even more handsome than she had imagined. His tall frame, broad shoulders, and confident smile sent a wave of excitement through her, though she tried to hide it. "I see you've made quite an impression on the village already," he continued, flashing her his signature smile. "But I think we should get to know each other more personally, don't you?" Akinyi felt her heart race. She had grown up in a different village, but even there, she had never seen a man as striking as Mboro. His charm was overwhelming. And though she had never been the type to fall for sweet words, something about him was impossible to resist. She smiled shyly and nodded. The days that followed were filled with secret meetings and whispered conversations between Mboro and Akinyi. At first, it was just flirtation, Mboro testing the waters, seeing how easily she could be won over. But to his surprise, Akinyi wasn't like the other girls he had courted in the past. She was not naive or overly impressed by his good looks. There was a quiet strength about her, an inner grace that made him want to know more about her. And for the first time in his life, Mboro found himself not just playing his usual game, but actually enjoying her company. However, his pride would never let him admit that Akinyi was different. To him, this was still a game, and he was simply seeing how far he could push the limits. He told himself that he was just trying out the younger women to see if they had any secrets worth discovering. After all, he was still in control. He could walk away at any time, couldn't he? As Mboro spent more time with Akinyi, his visits to Ndizi's compound grew less frequent. The older woman noticed this almost immediately. She had grown used to Mboro's attention, to the gifts and affection she lavished upon him in exchange for his time. The less he came to see her, the more anxious and insecure she became. One evening, Ndizi sat alone in her empty house, her mind racing. It had been days since Mboro had visited her, and the rumors she had heard about him and Akinyi were impossible to ignore. The men in the village spoke of Mboro's new pursuit, and Ndizi couldn't bear the thought of losing him to a younger, more beautiful woman. The idea gnawed at her heart, filling her with rage and jealousy. How could he do this to her? After everything she had done for him, after all the sacrifices she had made. She had given him her wealth, her time, her love, everything. And now, he was abandoning her for a girl who hadn't even been in the village long enough to understand what they had shared. In her fury, Ndizi decided to confront him. She would not be cast aside so easily, not after all she had invested in him. She knew where Mboro often spent his evenings, and she planned to go there the next day, hoping to catch him off guard. The next afternoon, as Mboro and Akinyi walked through the outskirts of the village, laughing and talking as if they were the only two people in the world, Ndizi appeared. Her figure, hunched with age but fueled by a seething anger, emerged from the shadows like a storm about to break. "Mboro," she called out, her voice trembling with fury. Mboro and Akinyi both turned, startled by the interruption. The sight of Ndizi filled Mboro with a sudden sense of dread, though he quickly masked it with a casual smile. "Ah, Ndizi, what brings you here?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light, but Ndizi was not in the mood for games. Her eyes flashed with anger as she approached them, her gaze shifting from Mboro to Akinyi and back again. "I know what you're doing," she spat, her voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just abandon me for her? After everything I've done for you?" Akinyi stood aside, watching the confrontation unfold with a mixture of confusion and concern. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could sense the tension between Mboro and the old woman. Mboro, ever the smooth talker, tried to diffuse the situation. "Ndizi, it's not like that. You know you're the one I care about. I'm just spending some time with Akinyi. There's nothing serious between us." But Ndizi wasn't fooled. The betrayal she felt was too deep, the hurt too raw. "You've made a fool of me, Mboro," she hissed, her voice shaking. "But you won't get away with it." She stormed off, her heart filled with bitterness and revenge, leaving Mboro standing there, for the first time unsure of what would come next. The air in the village grew heavy in the days following Ndizi's confrontation with Mboro. What had begun as whispers between a few had now spread like wildfire. People were talking about Mboro's entanglement with both the older, wealthy Ndizi and the beautiful, young Akinyi. Though most were unaware of the depth of Ndizi's rage, there was a quiet tension in the air, a shift in the way the villagers spoke about the situation. They could feel that something was brewing. Mboro, meanwhile, paid little mind to the growing unrest. His arrogance blinded him to the real danger. To him, Ndizi's anger was nothing more than the bitterness of an old woman who couldn't accept that he had moved on. He assured himself that she would come around eventually. After all, hadn't he convinced her time and again to overlook his dalliances with other women? This time would be no different, he thought, but Ndizi was no ordinary old woman. Her fury was unlike anything Mboro had ever encountered, for it was rooted not only in heartbreak but also in the dark powers she had spent her life cultivating. Unbeknownst to Mboro, Ndizi was a witch, one whose magical abilities had been feared and respected in the village for generations. She had kept her powers hidden from most, choosing to use them sparingly, but now that she had been scorned, there was no turning back. She would unleash the full force of her wrath upon him. Inside her compound, Ndizi sat before her shrine, a small room filled with the artifacts of her craft: cowrie shells, animal bones, candles, and jars of strange, foul-smelling herbs. Her heart pounded with fury as she chanted ancient incantations, calling upon the spirits of her ancestors to come to her aid. She had given Mboro everything, and in return, he had betrayed her. The thought of him parading Akinyi around the village, ignoring her sacrifices, made her blood boil. "Nguzo zie mababu, Sakini kilio changu," she whispered, her voice thick with venom. "Let him suffer as I have suffered. Let him know pain, shame, and fear. I call upon you, ancestors, to curse the man who has wronged me." The spirits stirred as she poured offerings of blood and honey into a bowl. Her hands moved with precision, drawing symbols on the floor with ash and animal fat. The power she summoned was raw and dangerous, the kind that could twist a man's fate beyond recognition. Her chants grew louder, filling the room with an eerie echo as the candle flames flickered wildly, casting shadows that danced along the walls. For 7 days and 7 nights, Ndizi performed her rituals, refusing to eat or sleep, pouring all her energy into the curse that would seal Mboro's fate. Each night, she spoke words of destruction over him, ensuring that no woman would ever look at him the same way again. "Hortawiza kam kufurahia mwanamka. Hortawiza tena," she growled. "You will never enjoy a woman again. You will never be a man again." Meanwhile, Mboro continued his life as if nothing was wrong. He spent his days with Akinyi, parading her around the village, unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. His relationship with Akinyi had deepened, though in typical Mboro fashion, he was already growing restless. He thought about how easily he had won her over, and once the thrill of the chase had worn off, he found himself craving more attention, more power occasionally. He would catch a glimpse of Ndizi watching him from afar, her eyes filled with a cold, silent rage. It unnerved him, but he quickly brushed it off. What could she do, after all? She was just an old woman. And yet, a part of him, deep down, a part he refused to acknowledge, felt uneasy. He had heard rumors of her powers before, but he had never taken them seriously. Now, seeing her angry, there was something almost dangerous in her gaze. On the 7th day of Ndizi's rituals, the village was preparing for its usual market day, where traders from surrounding villages came to sell their wares. It was a day of excitement and celebration, with villagers bustling about, laughing, bargaining, and enjoying the festive atmosphere. Mboro, as always, strutted through the market square with an air of superiority, his confidence as unshakable as ever, but something felt off. As he walked through the crowd, he began to feel a strange discomfort in his body, specifically in his groin. At first, it was just a mild itch, something he could easily ignore. But as the minutes passed, the sensation intensified. It wasn't just an itch now, there was something moving down there, slithering under his skin. He stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding as he glanced around to see if anyone had noticed his sudden discomfort. No one seemed to, but the sensation was growing stronger, more insistent. Whatever was moving inside him was alive, and it was writhing with a ferocity that terrified him. Mboro's mind raced. What was happening? He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just his imagination, but the feeling only grew worse. His skin prickled with fear as he looked down at his trousers, where the movement was now visible. Something long and sinuous was crawling beneath the fabric. Panic set in. Mboro tried to walk, but his legs felt heavy, as if they were rooted to the ground. His heart hammered in his chest, and his palms grew slick with sweat. His vision blurred as he tried to move, but it was as though an invisible force was holding him in place. He couldn't escape, couldn't run. Suddenly, with a loud ripping sound, his trousers tore open, and to the horror of the gathered villagers, a hissing snake slithered out from his groin. The people gasped, backing away in fear and confusion, their once beloved Prince Charming now a grotesque spectacle. Mboro's eyes were wide with terror as he looked down at the snake. His body trembled with fear as he realized the truth. This was no ordinary snake. It was part of him. It had replaced him. His manhood was no longer his own, it had been transformed into something monstrous. The villagers scattered, screaming in shock and disbelief, leaving Mboro standing alone in the market square, humiliated and terrified. His hands trembled as he tried to cover himself, but there was nothing he could do. The snake hissed, flicking its tongue in the air, as if mocking him, as if reminding him of the price he had to pay for his arrogance. With what little strength he had left, Mboro ran from the market square, fleeing into the forest, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge and desperation. He knew then, without a doubt, that Ndizi had cursed him. And now, he had to figure out what to do next, or his life as he knew it would be over. Mboro ran deeper into the forest, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing with fear and confusion. The snake that had emerged from his groin was still slithering, still a part of him, as if it had replaced what once made him a man. He couldn't understand how things had gotten so out of control. One moment he had been the village's most desired man, and the next, he was a monster, cursed by the very woman he thought he had mastered. The deeper he ventured into the woods, the more he was consumed by shame. What had become of him? The once proud Mboro, the man who had charmed women effortlessly, was now running from his own shadow. He could no longer face the people in the village. Their terrified stares, their whispers, their laughter. He knew they would haunt him if he returned. He had been their Prince Charming, their idol, and now he was nothing but a grotesque figure of pity and disgust. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. Mboro's footsteps crunched against the dry earth, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The snake, still attached to him, hissed occasionally, sending chills down his spine. He had no idea where he was going or what he was going to do. All he knew was that he had to get away from the village, from the shame, and most of all, from Ndizi's curse. After what felt like hours of running, Mboro collapsed at the base of a large baobab tree. His body was drenched in sweat, his muscles aching from the effort. The reality of his situation began to sink in. He had been cursed by a woman he had underestimated, a woman whose heart he had trampled on in his arrogance. And now, he had to live with the consequences. His thoughts drifted to Akinyi. What would she think if she saw him now? Would she still love him, or would she be repulsed by what he had become? The thought of her rejection was unbearable. Akinyi had been his latest conquest, the jewel in his collection, and he couldn't let her slip away. But how could he face her like this? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor, Mboro's fear gave way to anger. This was Ndizi's doing. She had cursed him, turned him into this creature, all because of her jealousy and rage. She had dared to defy him, to punish him for something that wasn't even his fault. He had never promised her love, he had only taken what she had willingly offered. How could she blame him for that? "I'll make her pay," Mboro muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing in determination. "I'll find a way to break this curse. And when I do, I'll make sure Ndizi regrets ever crossing me." But as soon as he said the words, doubt crept into his mind. How was he supposed to break a curse cast by a powerful witch? He had no knowledge of magic, no allies who could help him in this fight. The only person who might have answers was Ndizi herself, but she was the last person he wanted to confront again. Mboro stood up, leaning against the tree for support, and began to pace. His mind raced with possibilities, but none of them seemed promising. He needed a plan. And he needed it fast. The longer he stayed cursed, the worse things would get. He couldn't stay hidden in the forest forever. As he walked, he stumbled upon a small, overgrown path leading deeper into the woods. Something about the path felt familiar, though Mboro couldn't quite place it. He hesitated for a moment, then decided to follow it. Perhaps it would lead him to some kind of help, or at the very least, give him more time to think. The path wound through the forest, twisting and turning, until it led to a small, abandoned hut. The structure was old and crumbling, its thatched roof barely holding together, but there was something eerie about it. Mboro felt a strange pull toward the hut, as if it was calling to him. He approached cautiously, peering inside through the cracked door. The interior was dimly lit by the dying rays of the sun, revealing a cluttered room filled with strange objects, jars of herbs, animal bones, and wooden carvings. Mboro realized with a start that this was the home of one of the village's old medicine men, a healer who had vanished years ago under mysterious circumstances. As he stepped inside, the air grew thick with the smell of incense and decay. Dust clung to every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. But among the clutter, Mboro spotted something that made his heart skip a beat: a book. Not just any book, but an old, leather-bound tome covered in strange symbols. He had heard stories about such books, filled with ancient knowledge of curses, spells, and magic. Mboro's hands trembled as he reached for it. Could this be the answer he was looking for? Could this book hold the key to breaking Ndizi's curse? He flipped through the brittle pages, scanning the text for anything that could help him. Most of it was written in a language he didn't understand, but occasionally, he found passages in a more familiar dialect. One phrase caught his attention: to reverse a curse, one must first understand the power of the heart that cast it. The words echoed in his mind. The heart that cast the curse. Of course. Ndizi had cursed him out of love, or rather, the twisted version of love that she had for him. If he could find a way to undo that, to break the emotional hold she had on him, maybe he could free himself from her curse. But how? Mboro continued reading, his eyes narrowing as he pieced together fragments of information. It seemed that curses of this kind could only be undone through an act of true repentance or through a confrontation with the source of the curse. Either way, Mboro knew what he had to do. He needed to face Ndizi once more. He needed to confront her, to either break her heart's hold over him or force her to reverse the curse. The idea of confronting her again filled him with dread, but what choice did he have? His arrogance and pride had brought him to this point, and now he would have to swallow that pride and face the consequences. He had to go back to the village. He had to find Ndizi with the book tucked under his arm. Mboro left the hut and made his way back through the forest. His mind was a whirlwind of fear, anger, and determination. He didn't know how this confrontation would end, but one thing was certain: he was going to fight to reclaim his life, no matter what it took. The journey back to the village weighed heavily on Mboro, both physically and mentally. The cursed snake, still slithering and hissing as part of his body, was a constant reminder of his predicament. Every step brought new waves of shame and discomfort. He could still feel the villagers' terrified stares from the market square burning in his memory. Mboro, the charming prince, had become a walking horror, his pride shattered. The forest path opened up to the edge of the village, where the familiar sights of huts and farms came into view. He stopped for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He had one goal: to confront Ndizi. But what would he say? How could he face her, knowing what he had done? He thought back to the words he'd read in the old tome. To reverse a curse, one must first understand the power of the heart that cast it. It was clear now: Ndizi's curse was rooted in her broken heart. She had loved him, foolishly perhaps, but deeply. His betrayal had turned that love into something dark and vengeful. To reverse the curse, Mboro would need to confront the emotions that had caused it, but whether through apology, deception, or force, he wasn't sure yet. His arrogance had brought him here, and now, he would have to tread carefully. As Mboro approached Ndizi's compound, the village seemed strangely quiet. He could see her hut in the distance, its dark, ominous silhouette standing out against the setting sun. It was a place he had visited many times. But now, it felt foreign and dangerous. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of her power, and Mboro's steps slowed as he neared her door. He paused at the entrance, his breath shallow. What if she was waiting for him, ready to unleash even more horror on him? What if she refused to undo the curse? His body tensed at the thought, but he pushed the fear aside. He had no choice but to confront her. He knocked on the door. A few moments of silence passed, and then the door creaked open. There stood Ndizi, her eyes narrow and filled with a cold fury. She looked different, older, more powerful. The air around her seemed to hum with energy. Mboro swallowed hard, struggling to maintain his composure. "I see you've finally come crawling back," she said, her voice low and sharp. "What do you want, Mboro?" Mboro's mind raced, trying to find the right words. He knew that groveling wouldn't work on her, she was too smart for that. But at the same time, his usual arrogance wouldn't save him here either. He needed to find a middle ground, to appeal to her emotions without appearing weak. "I made a mistake, Ndizi," he said, his voice steady but careful. "I didn't realize. I didn't understand what I was doing to you." She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Oh, you didn't realize? You didn't realize that betraying me for a younger woman would hurt? That taking everything I gave you and discarding me like trash would have consequences?" Her words hit him like daggers, each one a reminder of the damage he had caused. He knew she was right, he had used her, manipulated her, and cast her aside without a second thought. Now, he was paying the price. "I was wrong," Mboro admitted, lowering his gaze slightly. "I thought I could get away with it, that you wouldn't care as long as I kept stringing you along. But I see now that I was foolish." Ndizi's eyes softened for a brief moment, a flicker of something resembling sadness crossing her face. But it was quickly replaced by the cold, vengeful look that had become her new mask. "You think saying you were foolish is enough to undo what you've done?" she asked, her voice dripping with contempt. "Do you think I'll just forgive you because you've finally come to your senses?" Mboro's heart raced. This wasn't going well. He needed to try something else. "I don't expect your forgiveness," he said, taking a step closer to her. "But I came here because I need your help. I can't live like this, Ndizi. You've taken away everything that made me who I am. I'll do anything to make it right." Her eyes narrowed again, this time with interest. "Anything?" Mboro hesitated, sensing the trap in her question. But he nodded. "Yes, anything." Ndizi stepped forward, her face now only inches from his. "What if I told you there's no undoing this curse, Mboro? What if I told you that you deserve every bit of suffering that comes your way?" The weight of her words settled over him, and for the first time, he felt a true sense of hopelessness. What if she was telling the truth? What if there was no way out of this? But before he could respond, Ndizi turned and walked toward her shrine. "You say you'll do anything," she continued, her back to him. "Then prove it." Mboro followed her into the dimly lit room, his eyes scanning the familiar array of strange objects, herbs, bones, animal skins, all laid out before a small, flickering fire. Ndizi stood over the fire, her hands hovering above it as if she were summoning something unseen. "To break this curse, Mboro, you'll need to offer a sacrifice," she said, her voice low and serious. "A sacrifice far greater than anything you've ever given. Are you willing to do that?" Mboro frowned. "What kind of sacrifice?" Ndizi turned to him, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Your pride. Your freedom. Everything that makes you the man you think you are." He stared at her, unsure of what she meant. "What are you asking for?" "I'm asking you to serve me," she said, her voice firm. "To become my servant, my slave. For as long as I see fit. Only then will I consider lifting the curse." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Mboro's heart pounded in his chest. Become her servant. Give up his freedom, his pride. The very thought was unbearable. But as he glanced down at the cursed snake still attached to him, hissing softly, he realized he had no choice. Ndizi's eyes bore into him, waiting for his answer. "Well?" she asked, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "Do you accept my terms?" Mboro hesitated, his mind racing with anger and desperation. But deep down, he knew what his answer had to be. If he refused, he would live the rest of his life as a monster, shunned by the village, his body a grotesque symbol of his downfall. But if he accepted, he would lose everything he had built, everything he prided himself on. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he spoke. "I accept." Ndizi's smile widened, and she let out a low, satisfied laugh. "Good. Very good. You've made the right choice, Mboro. But remember, this is only the beginning." She waved her hand over the fire, and Mboro felt a strange sensation wash over him. The cursed snake coiled tighter, then slowly began to retract, slithering back into his body. The pain was excruciating, but Mboro gritted his teeth and endured it.